What's up, y'all? Today I'm going to show you how to make 5 super easy Dariacore sounds that I've gotten a ton of mileage out of. So we're going to be going over how to make a percussive little laser zap, a willow snare or a Dariacore snare, a Jersey sub, a distorted saw sub, and a HyperPounce stab. And so we'll start things off here with how to make a laser. And there's two different ways that I approach making a laser sound. And one is by using a pitch drop, and the other one is a band sweep. So the basics of how this sound works, I'm just going to kind of show. It's a really short little volume envelope that I've then added a pitch drop onto the coarse pitch. And that controls how much pitch sweep we have. You can also change the rate to make it a little more percussive, or extend out the hold and make the rate longer for like a more sweepy laser. Then we also have the band sweep variation, and so it's the same idea, short little envelope, but instead of doing a pitch drop, I have, first of all, a little bit of noise in the oscillator. Is just kind of like a pretty wide. Basically, I want to have every section of the EQ like filled up with some sound, so when I do my pitch sweep, it can kind of sweep through there and give me like a zappy little tone. And so let me go ahead and make one of these live real quick. So I'll initialize my preset, put LFO1 onto the level and coarse pitch of my first oscillator, and then change that to a sine wave. So you should have a sound like that. Then switch LFO1 to envelope mode, turn the BPM sync off, and just make it the kind of shape I want. So that sounds decent so far. Next, I'm going to go in here and add a distortion and turn the drive way up on that, and then put an EQ before it. So the next thing I'll do is kind of fiddle with the rate and the shape of the LFO to get a kind of like percussive sound out of this, which is pretty popular in Dariacore. And then lastly, I can try using a different oscillator shape to get a crunchier sound with a saw wave. Pretty similar, but a little crunchier than a sine wave there. And then extra crunchy. And then if I want to get rid of that tail, I can just hold Alt while I click LFO1, drag it onto LFO2, remove that modulator from the level right there, and then just shorten the decay on my level there. Then lastly, I'll put some EQing into this. And then go back and change my pitch drop a tiny little bit. And so I think I'm happy with that. Just for an example of how to make one of these real quick, then you can click and drag right there. And if you want to shape it a little further, go in here, slam it, clip it, turn the volume down. Maybe use the pogo tool to get more percussiveness out of it. You can even turn the pitch down and then pogo it. And that's almost like a little HyperPounce laser right there. So before I move on to the next type of sound, I will just show real quick. You can use different types of sounds. Like I'm using that sound in this example to make different little sweeps go through them. So you can see I have my filter sweep there. I'm just compressing it before, I'm boosting it and cutting it after, and then compressing it after, and then clipping it. And the only thing to do here to make it sound, drastically different is you can change the BPM and get like a long sweepy laser, or turn it way up and get a kind of snappier laser doing that. So next I want to talk about the easiest way that I found to make Dariacore snares. So what I typically will do here is take a snare sample. I've used this kind of weird sounding pan snare and just start sending it through a bunch of effects. So the first thing that I did was change the time multiplier to pitch it up, then send it through a frequency shifter, which just kind of shifts it up a tiny little bit, introduces some weirdness, then a ring modulator. And I will say frequency shifters and ring modulators are what I typically hear on Dariacore snares. And then just heavy distortion, so then I have Fruity Blood overdrive. And then I use a volume shaper to cut the tail. And then a wave shaper to end up with like a really slammed out snare. Then the cool thing about that is once you've made that little rack, you can just start adding random snares. So that's a Leotrix snare right there. Pitch it up, try another one. So this is just another random snare. And I pitched that one up too. And then just keep adding a bunch of different snares. And you can even do stuff like percussion. So here I have a cowbell that ends up sounding like that. And you can just really easily like turn any of your normal snares into a Dariacore snare. Then you can go in and mix and match these. So try a couple different layers with the cowbell. That one's pretty nice. Then try a couple different dry layers. Right, so just real quick mix and match making Dariacore snares. Let's do them all together and see if that sounds good. Yeah, it's okay. It's a little messy. So then the next thing is I'll just make one of these again live so you kind of get the idea of what I'm going for here. So I have this unprocessed, really terrible sample, and I'm going to send that into my bus here. And then first thing that I'm going to do is just add some weird EQ curves. So one here, and then maybe like a sharp band right here. And then I'm just going to tune it in. There we go. That sounds good. And then I am going to add a frequency shifter, turn ring modulation on, and change it to 20k hertz. And then turn my mix down. Then I'm going to send it through some distortion and just boost this to a comfortable level. Change my color and then add some pre-band. There we go. And then another thing that I find myself doing sometimes is getting a convolver and adding a snare as my convolution source. But we'll do a cowbell this time, just because that's what's open. And then maybe move it above my distortion. And just shorten the tail on this. So you can use a volume envelope to do this. Turn self-convolution on. And then the wetness down a little bit. So we kind of have the start point of a Dariacore snare rack here. So let's go ahead and test this rack on a bunch of other snares. Yeah. So good snare, good input, makes a cool sound. Except for this one. This one sucks. So let me resample it. And use some ring mod on the input. And then give it like a transient layer. So one snare for the transient, one for this. Oh man, look at that. Bam. Cool Dariacore snare. So pretty much that's the way I go about making Dariacore snares. When I first started doing these, I would like try and make them to order. So like do intentional specific changes in my effects chain and stuff for each of the snares and make everyone different. But I've just kind of found that like slamming them into distortion and adding ring modulation and frequency shifting just tends to be the best results. And then the convolver trick works well too with most snares. So moving on to my next type of sound. So the next two sounds I'm going to be going over are going to be a Jersey sub and a distorted saw. And I made a little project to give them some context, so I'll go ahead and play this all together. And so there's a little mixing thing that I want to talk about before I get into how I did the sound design for these, and that is all of my different melodic layers are all bussed together into a distortion sandwich, I think is what I called. And this is something I've noticed, I think a couple different Dariacore people doing, is you can either bust your instruments into a distortion thing or just have your mastering chain have heavy distortion on it, or clip it super hard instead of like limiting it. And so what this does is everything that I send into here gets pushed way up by an OTT, right? So that brightens it a bunch and then distorted. And so for this section, it like really makes it a lot messier, right? And that's just kind of a good way to like glue stuff together and make you have like a solid wall of kind of heavier sound. And so I wanted to talk about that before I do the sound design parts, because they're going to end up way more distorted at the end result than they originally sound. So I'll turn the distortion sandwich off, turn the effects off, and then hop into my Jersey sub. So the basis for this sound is just, if I bypass all the stuff, a sine wave. And so I've given it a little amp envelope that isn't just sustaining, it kind of goes up and then goes back down. As you can see, it's traveling all the way back down that envelope one, and that's because like when you push it into a distortion, you can get different tones out of it. If I turn it all the way up, you get like a more steadily distorted tone versus a bumpier, like the distortion is happening the most heavily once it's at the peak, so as it goes down it distorts less. So then I also took that envelope and put it onto my drive for the distortion. It almost adds like a pluckiness to it that a filter would do. So the next thing that I have here is a filter, and it's pitch tracked and then set to just kind of move with the frequencies going on, and then drive is turned all the way up on that, and the mix is all the way up. Next, I added a pitch drop by putting LFO1 onto envelope mode, setting this little shape right here, turning my rate to be relatively quick, and then going into my matrix, LFO1 to the master tuning, turning the type onto the right arrow, which is unipolar, so it only goes up to down, and that goes from this to this. And then lastly, I put a chorus on this just to give it a little bit of space. And as you can see, it's barely adding any at all, even if it's all the way up. It only seems to be adding stuff to the high end on that. So then I put a Pro Q3, cut out the nastiness on the top end, and then sent it into a compressor just to kind of like even out the volumes there. And then with the distortion chain, the distortion sandwich, it sounds like that, but once you add in the music elements, you kind of lose, as you can, I don't know if you can hear that there, but you lose the distortion on the sub once you add in some high end to take that space up, because the OTT is going to be boosting that. Right, you'd lose the distortion off the sub. So that's pretty much it for that sound. The only thing I'll say here is you can mess with the rate of the pitch drop to give it a different tone. You can definitely do different shapes, and you can also not distort it at all or distort it a ton, right? The distortion is the main thing that kind of changes that sound for me. I also have a couple different ones where I use reverb on them, but duck the reverb. So next we'll go ahead and kind of move into the saw sub, because I don't want this to be too long of a tutorial. And this one is just a dead simple sound. And so what I've done to get the sound out of this one, this is with no effects. I've just basically taken both the oscillators, turned unison up to 12 on one of them and 15 on the other, and that lets me have a center voice on my right oscillator, and then all of my voices are kind of panned on my left one. As you can see, I turned the blend up, so this is like my width. This is like the wider width one, and then this one is kind of like the sharper width one. Then the next thing I did was I added a pitch drop on this, so I turned that in my master tuning the same way I just showed. And it just kind of adds a tiny little bit of pitch drop. Then I also use that on both of my oscillators detune. So they kind of start wider. It's super subtle. I don't even think that I would recommend that. It's just something that I happen to do for this patch. Then next I added an MG12 filter with a little bit of drive and then halfway mix. And you can definitely make this sound with the mix turned all the way up and kind of do like a weird Jersey sub or just a plain sub instrument or layer out of this by turning the mix all the way up. But for this case, I turned the drive up a little bit, put my cutoff where I wanted it, and then turned the mix down to half. Next, I put an OTT. And the only thing I changed there was the release and the threshold. Next, I sent it to an EQ. And I did something that I wouldn't say you have to do, but I cut the side on the low end. Actually, I wouldn't even say usually do this. This just happened to be what I did for this project. I cut the side out on the low end and boosted the mids, so it's a little more mid-heavy on the sub frequencies, but you definitely don't have to do that. It actually sounds a lot better, I think, sometimes with a pretty loud bottom side. Then I put an OTT on it, and as you can see, I boosted that low frequency, and the thing here is probably, it might have just been too wide. Let's actually go and test it. What does it sound like in the mix without that EQ on it? I put my distortion back on. Yeah, it's just like a little bit more washed out, right? Turn it on. It gives it almost like a dubstep-ier sound by having it on, I think, or just like a little heavier sound. So at this point, we're at this sound right here. And then I send it through the OTT and distortion master bus or mix bus. And it just makes it really loud and present. And so before I move on, I will say that one of the main things that's going to make your sound better, you can't really sound design it too much. You could work really hard on a patch and get it like cleaner than this or whatever. But I would say like use this patch a bunch of times and like work on your songwriting with it, because the more that you do songwriting with it, the better that it's going to sound. So here I have a bunch of pitch bending. And so when it's going up to those different notes, since it already has such a bright high end, it kind of like fits, right? And there is a separate sound that I layer on this E, so just know that's not the saw. So for the last sound that I'm going to cover, this kind of like a Dariacore staple. I don't really know what to call this other than like the HyperPounce Stab. And it's just like an interesting use of sampling. It sounds like this. In context with the little example I made here, it sounds like this. So I took the instrumental from We Found Love from Rihanna, and then I have no effects on this, and I just use this little breakdown part. And I thought that sounded pretty cool, and also didn't have too many drums. You can use a thing with drums, but drums sometimes can like give a weird flow if there's not like the same drum on the start of every piece. So I cut out different little stabs. And then I went in here and took the fade tool, this little thing right here, and just shaped it. So you can select all similar clips if you already made your melody. Let me say I want to reset all those. And then kind of just shape them how you want to. You can do them all at the same time if you use the select all piece. And then went in and just did some EQing. Right, made it way stronger. And then compressed it pretty heavily. Right? Just kind of slamming it out. And then I used a transient shaper to cut some of the attack off of it. And then an OTT. Brightening it up, sending it into a mix bus with another sound. So for this one, I just made a sub for it. So together those sound like that. And one thing I will say with the sub on this one, I had to sharply cut it right there, because if I didn't, it kind of clashed and took away from the stab a bit. And then send it through compression. I'm not going to talk about the sub really. And then just send them into this mix. where I boosted the side highs. So that's kind of quick going over it, but the reason I'm not going to spend too much time on this one is whatever sample you use, it's going to be a different application. So just, get yourself an interesting rhythm and do some weird stuff with the sample, and don't be afraid to be repetitive, because you're not going to have as much freedom as you have when you're like making your own sound with your own notes. So then I have another example here where I used part of a Dane guitar riff. As like a couple different layers. So I have like a slow layer here, and then I have a much faster riff where I did the same principle that I just showed in the other example. So I'll just go ahead and play this.
Shit knocks too hard, hit the left hook on the beat, cause a concussion. Yeah, and he playing my song, trying to decode, boy, and the need for the discussion. Spread out my heart, getting ego check, so he turn on my budget. And if it's bubblegum pop, boy, you're still down in your knees saying you love it.
So as you can see here, I have the guitar layer that I've kind of chopped up. So then I just put like a little plucky hard bass under it. That's mono. And then added like a stab on top of it to mix with those two. So then I'll just show one last example real quick of another way that I used this trick right here. Was just taking a piece from this Fall Out Boy track, putting it just as a stutter. Kind of sweeping in some filtering on it. And I'll just play this. So as you can see, this is kind of like a versatile trick that you can use, just, get creative, have fun with it. It's one that there's really no limits to what you can do. I kind of have 3 of the similar examples here, but you can do like all sorts of weird stuff using sampling. And so that's going to do it for this one, y'all. I'm going to put that Dariacore snare rack that I made in the description so you can get that if you've watched to this point. And thank you for watching. I will see y'all in the next one.